again to our Compass video series. Our purpose for this is to have some podcast-style discussions regarding child welfare, foster care, and adoption, and how we as a community can kind of come together to lift up children and families. I'm Kelly Mast. I'm the Director of Family Services with Compass. Been serving in this field for over 22 years. And today I have with me Linsey Ondrak. And just to tell you a little bit about her, Linsey Ondrak is an outreach and training specialist at the Nebraska Resource Project for Vulnerable Young Children at the University of Nebraska's Center on Children, Families, and the Law. Linsey is also a licensed independent mental health practitioner and provides outpatient treatment for children and their families. In 2007, Linsey received her Master of Arts in Community Counseling. She's continued to work with children and families since this time and has previous experience providing treatment for at-risk teenagers at a residential treatment facility in Colorado and working with Christian Heritage. Linsey, you've also been involved in foster care and adoption. Would you just give us kind of an overview of your family, your journey with foster care and adoption?
Mm-hmm. Yes, so my husband and I have been married for about 16 years, and we have 4 children, 2 that are biologically ours. They're 14 and 12-year-old boys, and then we've adopted 2 children out of foster care who are 6 and 5. So 3 boys and a girl.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
Yeah.
How long ago did you start your foster care journey, and maybe tell us about what drew you to serve in that way? Like how did that come about?
That has been a long journey. I feel like there's not a quick way to sum that up, really. Sure. Professionally, I knew that I wanted to work with children, but I also didn't know that would be specifically with children in foster care and adoption. And from the first families that I started working with, even in graduate school, were children who were either in foster care or in preserving placements. And so professionally, I kept being with kids that were in this journey and wanting to know more and learn more, and really saw the need for that in our communities. And also my husband and I separately, even before we were married, volunteered for Royal Family Kids Camp. So that has been a big part of our journey as well, just being able to be with kids, serve them, love them. I mean, the camp is designed to be for children who are in foster care or in adoptive homes. And so
having worked with Royal Family closely and having kids from my home go there, I'd say if you get involved with Royal Family Kids Camp, you're going to develop a heart for foster care, I think. Yeah. That's great. And so how long did you do foster care?
We did foster care for, 3 years, a couple years. Yeah. Not a super long time. The first children that were placed in our homes were the children that we adopted. Okay. So it was our intention that if we ever started doing foster care, that if those kids needed to move to permanency for whatever reason, that they weren't able to reunify with their parents, that we would adopt. Yeah. And so... Yeah.
Was that really, because I think this is a point of discussion with potential foster parents, with new foster parents, oftentimes, was like the desire to adopt really a part of your motivation to do foster care, or was it just more of an open-ended thing? We're going to do foster care and we're open to considering adoption if it's needed.
Right. Yes.
Both of those.
Really, I mean, it's like, you don't know when you're walking into it how you're going to support that family or what that situation is going to really look like. And I think for us, knowing we would be open to permanency was really important. We didn't want to have children in our home who then couldn't stay there if they needed to. Yeah. And so that piece was probably the most important side for us. If they were able to go home, that's different. Being able to be open to whatever that may look like.
Good. I think, that's a discussion that comes up. I think, in foster care training all the time, or people just taking those first steps. We think we want to be foster parents, sometimes there's that motivation. We'd like to adopt, and so let's check out foster care.
Yeah.
And so there's some important discussions that always need to happen around that. But that's good, being able to come into it with that open-ended mindset, open-hearted mindset of we want to support these kids for as long or as short as they need it. So that's great. How has foster care and adoption just sort of affected your family? Maybe how has it affected your biological kids? What have they learned through it? And then also maybe how has it affected your marriage?
That's a lot of questions in one.
Yeah. How's it affected your family, your journey of foster care and adoption?
Yeah. We did respite care for a lot of years, and I think that was really kind of a way of serving other people doing foster care.
Yeah.
And whenever you add a child into your home, it shifts the dynamics of your home. And so, that sacrifice to being willing to shift and go outside of your comfort zone sometimes to serve other children and their families, I think is a lot. I think that shifts for kids too. We went from 2 kids to eventually 4 kids. So the way you share your attention and tuning to all of their needs separately is it's a joy and a challenge all at the same time.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Did you and Zach, were there anything intentional that you found you needed to do in terms of your marriage during the journey of respite care, foster care, adoption? Or has it just sort of been focusing on your marriage sort of been the DNA of it all along? How has foster care and adoption affected your marriage?
I've had some families actually come to me and talk about, hey, you guys have adopted, you've done foster care. What is that like in that conversation always? I'm like, and let's talk about your marriage.
Yeah,
I think that's really important to be able to look at that and really be on the same page, to have good communication and good vulnerability and a really solid foundation in your relationship to know that any challenges that come, any things that you need to be vulnerable with, to have in those conversations, to have good communication, to support each other through that. But that's marriage too. That is marriage, to have a good solid foundation and whether you can invest more time in it or not. I think for us too, in supporting us as a couple, every week we go to Bible study together, and so it's that being able to read and pray together, but also have a community that's been able to support us. I think that was huge in our journey and probably
a little break from kids during that time as well, right?
Or
at least to some degree.
They
might be in the other room playing together.
Though they're learning and growing too, and being able to have a community around you that supports you, I think is really important for you individually and your marriage and your family. For
sure. That's so good. That it is interesting how challenging foster care and adoption can be on your marriages, and I like that's something you bring up with potential foster and adoptive parents. I think the degree to which you're bringing service home to such a personal space, it's 24-hour, 7-day a week. You can look at it as work or ministry, right? Where you're caring for someone else's kids. You're likely dealing with some significant trauma in those kids' lives. You're likely dealing with some emotional dysregulation in those kiddos, maybe some challenging behaviors. And then you're also welcoming a whole bunch of professionals into your home, right? You're getting visits from a caseworker, from a court-appointed special advocate at CASA, maybe an attorney, visitation workers, foster care specialists. They're all coming in and kind of asking questions about your home and things. And then in dealing with some of those challenging behaviors, you and your husband may have, or you and your spouse may have different philosophies on how those things need to be addressed. It may push on different buttons for each one of you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it can definitely be a challenging thing. I think having that support system, that support network, and some purposefulness, some purpose around being vulnerable and talking about some of those hard things, because it's a very, very personal way to serve, for sure.
Yeah, and your challenges are different. The things that you're struggling with or need more support in or need to talk about they look different, and how do you support each other in that?
I think that's something for people to take note if they're really considering foster care or adoption, to really get some foundation pieces in place for their own family, for their own marriage ahead of time. Get some healthy habits in place.
Yeah.
That's really good. Let's see. Today, kind of the purpose with your experience, I wanted to help folks understand the role of trauma and mental health therapy in child welfare and foster care and adoption. So I'd just kind of love to hear from you on that. How the role of therapy in the child welfare system and foster care and adoption. So first, let's start off with just what drew you to pursue a career in mental health therapy. How'd that get started for you?
I was young when I made that decision. I was probably 16, and so there's a lot of I was pretty naive at that point, I think, but also had a really clear calling, I feel like. I've gone back and asked my mom even, like, what did I say at that time? Like, where did that even come from? And I think
especially at 16.
Yeah, I was young, and you'd think as you grow and you're studying and different things that maybe that would shift. It never did for me. It was really clear that I had that desire just sort of that calling, I think, to really serve other people in that way. So that's what I did.
Wow. So from 16 on, I think my the direction for my life, I felt like, or what I wanted to do probably shifted about 4 times from 16 on.
Yeah, so, lucky in that way.
So let me ask you this. I think this is a good place to step off into the field a little bit. What are some attributes of a really great therapist? Like somebody just unequivocally gifted to counsel and help heal other people. What makes a great therapist?
It's hard to narrow that down. I go straight to love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and all of the attributes that come from that. It's interesting that love really is at the top of that for me, because we wouldn't necessarily think about a clinical relationship as loving, or maybe we could take that out of context, I should say, but to genuinely love people and really be with them and care about them and have grace towards them in all situations, I think is really important. And is you're not just showing up to, show up. Yeah. You genuinely are with them in their journey. And I think that that's really important, to be able to extend grace. And I think there's also a lot of peace that you need in those relationships as well. And I say that because we think about entering into really hard places with people and having difficult conversations and hearing really difficult things. If you're having a conversation with somebody and they're, you can see that they're not okay. Yeah. It makes it really hard to be with, to feel supported and to be okay to have those difficult conversations and to show that level of vulnerability with somebody. And so, not that you don't have emotion in that, but that you have a true sense of calm and compassion for people that you're working with. It's really big.
Wow, that's good. You just talked about, and of course there's some complexity around the idea of love in this clinical relationship. But you said to genuinely love people. What does that mean to you? And maybe in terms of kind of helping them heal and that sort of thing. What does that mean to you?
To genuinely love people?
Yeah.
Man, there's so many ways to genuinely just care. In your actions, in the way that you feel towards them, that lack of judgment that kind of comes into that space. To really invest all that you have into that relationship and to join them in a way that I think it really matters. To have that unconditional space of acceptance is really important. Yeah,
that's good. And I think, like you said, really being present with them, even at the end of maybe a long week of counseling others and stepping into those hard conversations, those really, really deep places and really, really deep wounds. You've been doing it all week long and maybe all day long, but still being able to show up. Yes. Really, really attending to what they're going through, what they're feeling, the struggles they're having, and helping walk with them towards healing. I think that really is a demonstration of love.
Mm-hmm.
That's neat. That's powerful. What, after these years doing therapy and being involved in the field, what misconceptions do you see people have as they begin counseling services for themselves or their children? Or maybe just what misconceptions do you see out there um, um, that affect people's attitudes towards counseling therapy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're human and we're not always going to connect to somebody. I've heard lots of stories about going to see a counselor and it's like, well, we didn't quite connect, and maybe personalities are different, or it's don't give up just because you didn't have a good connection, or maybe it wasn't a right fit for you, or maybe that wasn't exactly what you needed, and so we shouldn't stop seeking counsel if it's not first, we're not having a good response the first time. And I think we're all defensive in some capacity when we talk about being really vulnerable, so there's a lot of stigmas out there around counseling in general, but we want to really know that it is okay to be vulnerable. We're going to have these natural defenses that come into play sometimes for ourselves when we're seeking support and not wanting to maybe, those natural barriers that want to keep us from moving into counseling. Yeah, when we need it.
That's great. Sometimes I hear things from parents, particularly parents that might be struggling with a teenager that's been through a lot and they're dealing with a lot, or maybe a kid. This idea that if I get my kid to therapy, that counselor, that therapist is going to fix my kid, and maybe even the attitude of fix my kid, because I can't deal with these behaviors anymore. What would you want parents to know kind of in that situation?
Yep. We're on the same lines here, I think, thinking about that. It's very common. We need to be a part of that treatment as much as possible as a parent, because it is so, I always say, I don't get to go home with you. A lot of times we need to work with parents on that involvement and that healing process, and being able to support their child through those things too is just as important in those times that we're not just removing the parent. I involve parents, it doesn't matter how old the child is, as much as possible into that treatment, because it's only going to benefit their relationship, and that's huge.
Yeah, and the fact of the matter is that parent has undoubtedly the most influence on that child's life, on that child's well-being, on that child's progress. Of course, especially if we're talking about a teenager, that teenager, that youth has got to be willing to put the effort in to do their own work. But second to that parent has the most influence, probably far and above you as a therapist.
Absolutely.
Right? To affect their child's well-being and outcomes. So that's good. Kind of in this same vein, before maybe somebody is considering therapy, maybe for the first time, they've tried everything they know to do on their own. Maybe they feel like there's some things they're dealing with that are beyond the reach of their own resources or their pastor maybe. What would you want that person to know, or what would you want them to know sort of going into or before they start therapy? Anything you'd say to that?
I think that goes back to understanding why you're going, why are we seeking that out, and knowing that it's always an option, first of all, but also I think it goes back to those, we have these defenses in seeking out counselors, and so we really want to understand why we want to go and what keeps us from going, and to be able to seek that support when we need it. I think we all at some point in our lives benefit from counseling or from seeking wisdom from other people, and that we're designed in that way. And so really being able to seek it out when we need it. And
anything you'd say about like helping somebody, that person who's not familiar maybe with therapy, finding the right therapist for them? Anything they can do kind of in their research or ahead of time to find the right, or set themselves up the best for finding the right therapist for them. Of course, like you say, there may be just a lack of chemistry there, and they may need to try somebody else. But what can they do ahead of time to find the right therapist, set themselves up the best for that?
I think I always take time to answer questions that people have, you know, when they're calling, and help them to navigate even if I'm not able to see them, because we want to be able to. You want to be able to call somebody and ask those questions, or even come in and have those conversations and see, you know, what do you do? This is my need, and what do you provide, and what would we do? You know, and so I think being able to do that with a counselor, and if that's not quite what you're looking for, or quite the right fit, or you need something else that's maybe somebody else specializes in, that person's able to help shift you there too. So I think requesting to have those conversations up front is one of the best things that we can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. That's excellent. I think sometimes we think as soon as you show up or you get that first appointment or something like that, it's like you're kind of locked in, and you're saying, spend some time asking some questions, hear their philosophy, get a sense of them as a person.
Absolutely.
And what they can offer in terms of what you're wanting to work on, right? Good. How's becoming a mental health professional impacted your personal life, maybe with family, friends, your spouse? I think sometimes, it can feel like, oh, now I'm a friend with or I'm in relationship with a relationship expert. Or maybe that's come into play in some of your relationships, but are there other ways that being a therapist has affected your personal life and your relationships?
That's a good question to pause and to really think about. I think that certain people do seek you out, or maybe don't seek you out purposefully when you have that hat on. I think that friends and family probably do seek us out sometimes. Even my husband and I both, when things come up, right? Or there's questions, or somebody's struggling, or something happens in the family. So that's very real. But that is what it is, I think. Yeah. And it is who you are and what you do, I think, in any other profession. I would lie if I had said we hadn't texted, doctors from our church when, some things come up and, hey, can I check in on this really quick? So, I mean, you tend to seek those people out sometimes in those situations. Personally for me, I find myself volunteering with kids. So even in my free time, I'm wanting to volunteer in different ways. And that's had to shift over time, and what I can do and not do, and a good balance for our family. But I think seeking out how else I can serve kids has always been part of me as well, whether that's in our church or community.
Yeah, good. I won't ask if your kids or your husband ever claim that you might be trying to counsel them or do therapy. No, I wasn't going to ask. I can just imagine that conversation taking place.
Can you please take off your therapist hat, Mom?
Right.
Yes,
right.
I've heard that a few times, especially.
Okay, all right. Well, I didn't ask, but how in what ways maybe have you seen your profession change from the time you started until now? Like, what are some changes you've seen?
The mental health field is always growing, always changing. There's always the research.
Love new training. I know that.
And really, you're required to continually train. And I think that's good. I mean, we should always be growing and learning, and have that willingness to do that, especially where we see that need for ourselves or the families that we're serving. I think, I hear this a lot of, what's one good thing that came out of the pandemic and in the last several years, telehealth has been a very interesting shift in the clinical world.
Meaning like therapy over a Zoom type platform, right? Okay.
And it did exist prior to that, but minimally, or insurance companies didn't recognize, they didn't want that to be a part of what they'd even allow. I would utilize it really if I had like a parent, driving from an hour away. And so maybe we needed to have conversation before sessions or do parent sessions or something like that helped it to be possible to do treatment and and still be able to work with them as afar.
Yeah.
But when the pandemic hit and everything went virtual, things have obviously slowed, but we still have a lot of options of telehealth. And I think that's been helpful in a lot of communities in different ways where there isn't services. I mean, even right now I'm teaching a circle security class virtually, and I never would have even dreamed about it. In fact, when everything got shut down, I said, I'm not doing that.
Yeah,
I don't want to teach it virtually. What are you talking about? But then parents are able to join and learn in different communities that don't have access to it. So
for sure,
it's been an interesting shift.
Yeah, I heard about foster parents or folks driving an hour and a half each way for therapy.
Yes. And we get that here a lot. Yeah.
When you're thinking about it, sometimes therapy can be an uncomfortable step. I think we need this, but boy, digging into all of those conversations, that's not comfortable, or the idea of it may not be. And then you add on to that an hour drive each way or an hour and a half drive each way. That'd just be one more barrier and reason to say, no, we're not going to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think telehealth has been helpful, especially making resources available to rural families or individuals. So that's good.
Mm-hmm. Hey friends, thanks for joining us in this video. I want to encourage you to give during Give Where You Live. Open Giving is already open, but feel free to join us on the day of Give Where You Live on December 5th. There's a couple different ways for you to donate, so please check out that information in the caption. Thanks.
Okay. Linsey, what could you tell us about how childhood trauma affects the children you've worked with, you've seen in the foster care system? How does trauma affect children?
Well, the first thing I think about is in utero trauma, which we don't commonly talk about, but that's very real for us in our house because the children that we adopted experienced a lot of trauma during pregnancy, just ongoing stress, I think, during that time, and violence in the home, and exposure to toxins and substances. And so I think sometimes we forget that is a really important time of development and can be really impactful. Children can experience so many types of trauma after birth too. And I think when we think about our stress response system, it's activated at the time of birth too, right? So that's why you can startle a baby and, so we're affected by stress in different ways. And
really quick, let's dig into that in utero trauma a little bit more, because I think it's a common thing for people, particularly people outside this field, to think, those things took place, like domestic violence or neglect or whatever, before this child can remember anything. So they were an infant or in utero. They think, well, that's good because they won't be able to remember that. That won't affect them emotionally or affect their relationships. So tell us a little bit more about how you talked about like pervasive stress of the mother. Like, how does that affect that baby in utero, and then how does that affect their life moving forward potentially?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, stress, definitely. I mean, there's all types of chemicals that are released during that, when you're pregnant, that impact the baby, and putting things in your body affects your baby.
Yeah.
And so, that level of stress and dysregulation definitely is felt by the baby when they're developing. We all experience normal amounts of stress too. So, I mean, that's to go to say, it's not like you're pregnant and you wouldn't have some level of stress in your life, but more severe, ongoing, stressful situations can really impact the child.
Yeah.
And so then when the baby's born, you can see effects of that. We see disruptions of regulation in their normal biological rhythms when we talk about like their eating and their sleeping and just
maybe their ability to calm themselves, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So as a pseudo layperson, I'm not a therapist, not a neuroscientist, I'll often tell people that say things like that, like, oh, that happened to them before their initial memories, so it shouldn't be as significant. Right. But I'll often say that the more brain development that's happening when a trauma occurs, it often is more impactful on a child or somebody's life. And in utero, there is when the most brain development is taking place.
Right.
Anything you would say to kind of correct that, or is that, would you call that accurate?
Oh, no, that's accurate. I mean, everything is growing. And even when we think about infancy, right, there's the most growth and development during infancy when we talk about brain development. It's so fast. The neural connections that are being made are so rapid, and those pathways are really being laid out. And it is impactful. I think there is a lot of misconception around that because it's implicit memory. It's memory that you can't verbalize, and it is pre-verbal. And so we're not going to have these verbal recognitions of things when we were little, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't really real and that our body doesn't experience whatever adversity or trauma that may occur during that time.
Yeah. That's good. I think that's a key thing for people to understand, that trauma that happens in utero and trauma that happens in infant years, in pre-verbal years, is incredibly impactful on kids in their future years. And sometimes, those attitudes of, well, you adopted that child as an infant, and so they should be okay. They should be okay. Absolutely. Yep. And when the reality is that the stress of a homeless mother, or that pervasive stress of a mother in a domestically violent relationship, or somebody that's using substances, those pervasive hormones and neurochemicals or external chemicals are incredibly impactful on those kids moving forward. Well, how does childhood trauma, whether it's pre-verbal or just in their childhood years, how does that affect somebody as an adult or into their adult years? In what ways does trauma affect adults?
Well, in all the ways, right? We can think of when we think about how does a traumatic experience affect us. I think when it's unprocessed, and we haven't been able to really metabolize it and work through it, it can continue to impact us in not a good way. I often think about how does that carry to our children too? We think about becoming parents into adulthood and having early traumatic experiences, and how do we carry those forth in our parenting? We think about that with positive experiences as well, but we want to have a really good understanding of how we're doing, and then also think about that as we're parenting too, because subconsciously some of those things can continue to come out in our relationships and in our parenting. How
specifically, how does maybe childhood trauma affect somebody's, potentially affect their relationships as a young adult or as an adult?
There's various ways that it can affect relationships, obviously, but trust, safety in relationships.
So we say
where
trust.
Where are you going to go with it? That's where I was going to say. There's so many things that you can.
I realize that could. So when you say trust, like the idea that almost even a subconscious or instinctive feeling that, well, things are good now, but when is the shoe going to drop in this relationship? Is that kind of what you mean by that, or would you go somewhere else with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we talk a lot about attachment, insecure attachment, and in the clinical world more than now I think we ever have talked about it. But if you rewind and we go back to how our relationships are formed and how that impacts, it starts with our parents, and then that impacts our worldview and how we view relationships down the road. And so those experiences that we're having, it really makes a difference in our relationships, and how do we feel secure and safe to have these conversations, and how do we trust others, and protective factors that we naturally sort of put in place in our conversations that we can shift to adapt and be in relationship with each other, whether that's positive or that's negative.
Yeah, good. You mentioned like unprocessed trauma. Explain to us a little bit about what does that mean to process trauma, Yeah. So you're talking about the effects of like unprocessed trauma. What does it mean to process trauma? What does that look like? What does that process look like?
Well, it can look differently depending on, again, your age.
Sure.
So if you're talking about an adult or a teenager or even a very young child, but being able to, we think about any sort of traumatic event or ongoing events that may happen. So there's a difference. We're talking about something acute or ongoing. Being able to lean into that. I think commonly when we think about anything stressful or traumatic, we want to avoid it or kind of dance around it. We really have to go into the trauma and allow our body and our brain to process it. And I think about it as I want to be able to think about something that's traumatic that's happened to me and still be okay. My brain and my body aren't, my nervous system isn't so dysregulated and so activated that I can't even bring it to mind or have a conversation about it or whatever that may look like. And so we need to be able to process that. And that can look differently depending on what it is and the circumstances and different things, but to help that move through us in a way that helps reduce the effects that it has on our brain and our body without going into all the terms of that.
So I hear you saying like, so that you might be able to think about a traumatic experience, whether that is a really terrible car accident from a couple of years ago, or whether that's a childhood filled with abuse and neglect.
Yes.
Where I can think about that scenario without experiencing like a state of panic, to put it really like a coarse point on it. If that's sort of the goal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is the goal. Yeah. And I think we get a lot of misconception around that too, because why would I want to bring this in that's going to make it worse?
Like talking about it, addressing it.
To lean into it. And it can look differently. Treatment, when we talk about trauma, between relationships, sometimes there's needs to be healing. There's different types of treatment to address trauma, depending on circumstances as well. I think EMDR and brain spotting have their place, definitely, when we talk about how do we activate the parts of our brain and our body that where the trauma is really stored.
Yeah.
And
describe those just a little bit. EMDR, brain spotting, just so that somebody outside the field would have an idea of what that is. Mm-hmm.
I think the simplest way to think about that really
That's what we're going for.
That, to not talk about all the levels of all of the things, but really the easiest way, and even the way I would say I talk to kids about it, is that when we're talking about something, we're using a different part of our brain than where that traumatic stress is stored in our brain. So where those memory networks are, and where that activation comes. If you think about something that is traumatic, you're going to feel it in your body too. Yeah. Without thinking about
Adrenaline and all of that.
If you're feeling that activation in your body, it's stored in there. And so we're using different techniques to really help you safely go into that, to minimize the dysregulation that you feel from those experiences and to allow that to process.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say in some ways taking that experience that's stored like almost subconsciously or instinctively, bringing it up to a more conscious place and verbal place where you can talk about it and process it? Some of those are some of those techniques are sort of bringing those two places together. Is that a way to say that?
That would be a way to say it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. Anything, any real differences in, you touched on acute trauma versus like a prolonged trauma. So again, a really horrific car accident from a couple of years ago versus the first 12 years of my life living in a really dysfunctional and harmful home. Are there significant differences in how you might go about processing those two different types of trauma?
Yeah, so what you're naming is a very acute one-time incident versus ongoing chronic stress. And that looks differently. So it's much more complex, and it also impacts our relationships. So A one-time incident can be processed fairly quickly, I would say, whatever that's relatively quickly, give or take. More complex situations are going to take a longer time, and they're going to involve, when we talk about early childhood, it's going to also involve that parent or caregiver as being a part of that process as well, which is much different when we have abuse or neglect of some type occurring, and we haven't had a person consistently coming into those situations to help us process what's been happening. The effects are much greater when we haven't had somebody in the midst of that. So it can look differently depending on the support that child's had through those early years too.
Yeah. Is there a role, just thinking about that, like you're talking about all of that and the caregiver being involved, is there, I imagine there's probably a role in working through, in the church world, we would talk about forgiveness, like not only processing some of those subconscious responses, those physiological responses to the trauma. When I think back to that time in my life, when I think back to those times, those early childhood years, whatever it might be, some of those physiological responses, but then also dealing with the relational side of that pervasive, long-lasting trauma is working through forgiveness and letting go. Is that a part of that journey, and what does that look like?
Oh, absolutely. That could look like a lot of different things, but we're built to be in relationship with each other, and we need healing throughout that, and being able to it's one thing to accept mercy and grace that we're given, and then it's a whole other thing to extend that to other people in our lives, and where are our thoughts around that? What are our belief systems about our relationships, and how do we challenge that for ourselves? And that can look so differently depending on, your experiences and how you see relationships. And so, forgiveness is a huge part of that.
Yeah, I imagine it is, because like those early relationships are so key to our relationship formation, our perspective on all of those things. But then those thoughts of, I've worked with so many kids over the years that sort of this pervasive hurt in their life is that person or those people, mom and dad, whatever, that were supposed to be watching out for all of my basic needs and for my safety. They were the ones that I was afraid of, or they were the ones that I couldn't rely on, maybe. And so that's a lot to work through.
Absolutely.
So more and more, and we've just talked about trauma quite a bit, more and more, I think we're hearing about trauma amongst our communities, in our schools, in our churches. We want, we hear the term be trauma informed. So that's coming up more and more. Where, if anywhere, have we gone wrong or maybe overboard in thinking about trauma in our communities? Do we look for trauma kind of around every corner where maybe it's not present?
Mm-hmm. I think my best answer to that is to, when we think about stress, for example, stress is very subjective. So
sure.
It's everything and every experience that you're bringing into that room, into that moment, and how you perceive whether it's stressful or not. So it's subjective. So that's why we can have two people, we can be in the same meeting, and maybe I'm super dysregulated, and you're like thinking, Linsey, why are you freaking out right now? It's no big deal, right? It's the same way I think when we think about trauma. Mm-hmm. All of the things come into play into that moment, that it is our perception and our subjective experience of what's happening. It's our protective factors coming into play too. And are we overwhelmed, and it's overwhelming, and it has a larger effect on us or not. And so I think with that said is we're looking to the person to communicate to us whether something was traumatic or not. Yeah. And I think we can assume responses. You're talking about a car accident earlier. I brought to mind a family that I had worked with, and the mom I previously worked with these 2 kids, and she had come back in. They had been in a car accident. And so she was worried about them. And so I said, yeah, bring them in. We had discharge treatment. We weren't working together, but she wanted to make sure they were okay. And so she brought them in. One child was in the car with her.
Yeah.
And the other child was watching them outside and saw the accident happen.
Oh, wow. 2
And
very, very
so,
different experiences of a very
right.
stressful situation.
So 2 experiences, right? A little bit different. But her response at the end of it was like, what? The child who was in the car actually was more okay than the child who had thought that his mom and brother had died.
Yeah, wow.
His effects and his long, and so even in that, you think, and you're trying to navigate that with your kids, and it was like, oh, okay, we're in much different places and the effects look different. And so even as a parent, you're looking at your children and saying, how are you doing? And right, what do you need? And how is this impacting you? And what can I do? And so I think we have to really individualize things, and not assume, and we can assume wrong.
Yeah, for
That's
sure.
what I'm saying too.
Well, I want to be sensitive to your time here, so we're coming close to the end. But one thing I wanted to touch on, and you've alluded to it just a little bit, but as foster parents, I know you and I both have heard this question quite a bit. Folks that are not close to the foster care world, they'll often, one of the first questions they'll ask foster parents is, how do you do that and not become too attached to those kids? Or they'll often say, I could never do that. I would become too attached to those kids and then I could never see them go home. Like, talk to us just about the role of attachment in foster care and what role does that play? How important is that? Should we guard against becoming overly attached as foster parents, or is attachment ultimately important? Just talk to us about the role of attachment.
Yes, there's so many things that come to mind with that.
Yeah,
it's
a huge topic.
It just happens. People just sort of come and share those pieces with you when you become a foster parent, which was really it was an interesting shift for me, hearing those things. And I would just pause and educate them in those moments because I think that's just great. And I would say becoming a foster parent, we really want to have this knowledge, really, that we should be loving them wholly. And it, like you were talking about earlier, you take this child into your home and you're loving them. And children need to have that kind of love. Yeah. It's so important and in every aspect of our life. If we could imagine not having that for a time, right? And not having that unconditional love from a parent, where maybe it is for a short time or maybe it's a long time. It's absolutely imperative that we are loving in that capacity. And when we think about it in terms of secure attachment, research, not to go into research too much, but it tells us that to protect our mental health, we need to have at least one loving, secure, attached relationship. Yeah. And we can do that with more than one parent and more than one caregiver. And so absolutely we want to foster good relationships. And, when we think about being foster parents, to know that, yes, we're going to love this child wholly. And what does that look and feel like? And
I think for our family and for others that we've been around, come into contact with, talked with, it's really kind of striking that balance between fully loving and accepting this child, sort of considering them just part of the family for the time being, and really, really trying to care deeply for them. Yeah. And I think the way to sort of so on the other side of that is knowing that this child very likely is going back home, right? And so what I often talk about is coming in from the very beginning, that mindset. And we talked on a previous episode about coming in with a mindset from the very beginning that we are planning on these children going home. We're going to love them fully while they're here, right? But planning on talking about, even praying for them to go home to their so that's in our hearts and minds from day one, maybe even before they move in. And then, like you said at the beginning, with kind of hearts and minds open, should these kids need permanency. And that's not the answer for every foster family. I'm not saying every foster family needs to be ready to adopt every child that comes into their home.
Right.
But I think it's good to be open to the idea of it, right? But that idea of loving them fully while having your minds set on from day one that this child is likely going home. And the best scenario would be those parents finding health and stability and safety so that their children can come home. And I that's what I would tell a foster parent or prospective foster parent is that's a great way to prepare where you can be attached and sort of protect yourself from as much hurt as possible when they do go home. It is a bittersweet day when reunification happens, but it's the best outcome for those kids. So.
And I love it when foster families of, reunifications happened and they're still able to be an integral part of that family's life. Not always, but become like an aunt or become like a grandparent or whatever it may be and continue to support that child and the family. And a lot of times families need that kind of support after reunification too. And so I love that. And that's able to be a really healthy, ongoing relationship too. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, Linsey, thank you. Again, I want to be sensitive to your time, but we wanted to talk to you. You've been a friend of Compass for a long time. We know that you've been a foster parent, adoptive parent, and very experienced in the therapeutic world and have a lot to share. So hopefully those of you watching have learned a little bit more about the role of therapy and childhood trauma in this world of child welfare, foster care, and adoption. Learned a little bit about that and had kind of a deeper understanding of that. Thank you again, Linsey, for sharing your time with us. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.